the sound on here is a little funky again. It seems like it's light, but the only way that I can reset it is to turn it off for about 5 minutes, and I don't want to do that right now. I just want to get started. All right, there is a folder out there where it always is, you know, with today's date on it, just so you see what's in there. Wanted to mention this to you. There's we're going to go over Chapter 5 right now. These are the programs for Chapter 5 that are out of your book. One of them, I think it's the layout one, but I'm not sure. Literally, he just puts like a label on there and talks about using the auto layout, you know, to resolve it. So that's not a big one. The restructure one that's in here, that's the last one, I believe. That one talks about adaptive layout. And adaptive layout is something that's new for iOS 8. And it used to be that when you wanted to have different resolutions, etc., and you wanted to change around a lot of stuff between using iPhone, iPad, and landscape and portrait, that you had to make quite often you had to make different storyboards. You don't have to do that anymore. And I do want to mention, these are some this thing that says size classes here. This first one, there's nothing wrong with any of these, but I wanted to mention this document that's right here. Where is it? I just found out because I never tried this before. I don't have Word on this machine, but I open up a Word document and it comes up, which I thought is kind of cool. But this is a thing that I put out there. This is one of those Ray Wanderlich tutorials, and it's called Beginning Adaptive Layout Tutorial. I went through it last night. I didn't key all the stuff in, but I went through the tutorial last night, and literally it's set up that it's a very simple weather app that'll work in all sorts of, you know, in both orientations on all sorts of different formats. It's about 35 to 40 pages long, but a lot of it is just pictures. What I really liked about it, though, is if you walk your way through it, you get a better understanding. And, you know, you're going to get a better understanding by looking at tutorials, etc., sometimes at least, if not most of the time, as opposed to me trying to you know, blow the stuff by you. So I thought that was pretty good. I also put these in there just so you see this. Let's see. Can I format font? How about bigger? All right, format font. I'll leave it there, that's fine. These are a few things that I found out online, and I know these because I watched them over the weekend. Now, with some of them were longer than other ones. This one, I don't know if this is the one, how to build iOS interfaces in auto layout programmatically. That one literally is. That shows you how to do it using just code. So if you would rather learn how to do this stuff using code as opposed to running it through the storyboard and interface builder, that'd be the one for you. Most of these that are in here, they're fairly short. They're 10 to 15 minutes long each. All right, and like I said, I went through them, and by and large, they were pretty good. Okay. Again, as always, rather give you a little bit too much information than not enough information. So, again, there's a couple of other articles in here that are pretty good. Now I noticed one of the PHP ones that I couldn't find. It's because I threw it in there. All right. So, again, what we will be going over here is Chapter 5. As you can see, it's rotation and adaptive layout. There's actually 3 different programs that are built in here. Just so you're aware of this, I mentioned this to you in an earlier class, but I want you to hear this. You don't have to do this now. You don't ever have to do it. But if you do go out onto Blackboard and you go under the videos link, I am taping this like I'm doing now, and I'm putting that out there, okay? But I'm also going through the chapters on my own and taping them from home because I can spend a little bit more time doing it. So for this one, I've already done, there'll be 3 tapes. I've already got the first 2 done, and they're up there. I wanted to do the other one this morning. I pulled in and thought, guess what you did for the first time this semester? You forgot to bring the Mac with you on a Tuesday or a Thursday. That's why my wife met me for lunch, so she could bring the Mac with her. All right, so I didn't get it done, but I'll try to get it done if I can tonight. We'll see how that works. All right, But for the last chapter, for chapter 4, the one that we went over previously, there's about 3 or 4 lessons that are out there, and then there's the one that we did in class. You may or may not have heard me say this, but the one I did in class last week, when you get done, of course, you stop the recording. I stopped the recording, it didn't stop. And I noticed later, wow, it didn't stop, so I stopped it again. It didn't stop the second time. So finally I went in and did it the third time. So where this should have been about 48 minutes, it was an hour and 41 minutes, because there was, and it wasn't all dead air. You've got me saying, because somebody asked the question, why are they still having the access class? And I said they're doing it so somebody else, and that's on there. I didn't like that, so what I did was I cut it, went back and reproduced it, but for some reason, even though I cut it, it didn't take the save. So it was still on there. It was still an hour and 41 minutes. So I went back into the original one again and cut it again and saved it, and then saved the save and did that one. So it's now down to 48 minutes. As far as I know, all that stuff that shouldn't really have been taped is no longer taped. All right? So all that stuff is out there, just so you know. All right. So in this chapter, they talk even more about auto layout. And I know we've been talking about it. They continue to talk about auto layout in here. And it's funny because this chapter concentrates a lot too, as you can see, on rotation. But most every single tutorial that I put out there, most every single YouTube video I put out there, someplace or other during the tape or during the tutorial or whatever, they'll say, auto layout's one of the hardest things to learn in this language. And to me, it's just really interesting because it's sort of become almost more important than the design itself. I don't think that that's necessarily a good idea. But it used to be, you know, that everything you did, nothing was GUI. Everything you did from a command line. So you concentrated on just the language. Then we got GUIs. All right, so you have to concentrate on the GUI, and you had to concentrate on the language. All right, now it's GUI and it's language, but it's also how to lay it out on the screen. Because you already know this, that you can have it look fine in a simulator and it looks bad on an actual device. All right, and again, they continue on with that in this chapter. So I don't want to read to you. This is what we talked about before, though. Prior to iOS 8, if you wanted drastically different formats, all right, for landscape and portrait, typically it meant that you had to have 2 different storyboards. Not the case anymore. All right, and I will tell you, because we'll look at some stuff that we may or may not have looked at before, I don't remember. And a little bit of it is hinky. And what I mean by that is you can follow instructions that I give you or that are in a book or whatever, and it may or may not work exactly the way you think it will work. All right? And one good point the author makes in here is he starts talking and he has you build an app. Then he has you make some simple changes. And then he says, now let's make more changes. And you've heard me say this before, but he says, you know what? Before we do this, let's make a copy of what we've been working with so far, and let's work with that copy. All right? So again, if you start to tweak a project, be it one in here, or if you ever decide you're going to try to put your own out there on the App Store or whatever, you know, and you're like, wow, this is really good. I think I'll make a couple more changes to it. Make changes to a copy, or at least take the one that's pretty much the way that it should be and copy it someplace. All right, back everything up. And I don't mean back it up in case you lose it. I mean back it up so when you make changes to it, that you say are real minor changes, but you screw everything up, you can go back to the original. All right? And if you say, geez, I never do that, wow, then you probably haven't been doing it long enough, to be honest with you. Now, he gets into the author here on the bottom of page 139. Again, don't want to read, but they start talking about Retina Display. All right? And the whole idea of talking about points versus pixels. Okay? And there'll be some charts in here, and there'll be some stuff in here that'll, for lack of better words, will sound a little bit goofy. But as I said, if you work with it, and I'm still in the process of learning it, but if you work with it, I think it makes more sense the more often that you work with it. You've heard this shtick before. That's what you get by default. Does everybody understand, too, you know, that if I come in here and, see, I've got all the ones, too, that he told you to do. But I'll just start, I think the first one, yeah, that is this way up. I'm just going to start a brand new project right here in Xcode. What I'm showing you right now, it's no big gee whiz thing, but just so you see it. First one you build is this way up, so since I've done it, I'll just make it this way up too. When you first bring up a project, you've seen this before. Yours doesn't look exactly like mine because I still get this provisioning error right there, but don't worry about that. The point is, this is your opening screen. I don't think that's anything new to anybody. And you know that if you want to make it landscape only, portrait only, you do it here. But you may or may not have known that if you go up to the top here, and if you double click right there, no, that wasn't right, sorry. Where are we? There we go. Under supporting files, if you click on info plist, it's got most of the same information. It's not all of the same stuff, but you can change a lot of the information in here also. Some people are more comfortable going in there. What you have on that screen that comes up at the beginning, some books refer to it as an alias to this. All right, but you can make changes in either place. You go, I don't care, then don't ever use it. So again, he talks about upside down. I don't think that's really that big of a thing in here, so. All right, so the first thing that he has you do here on page 142 is build this thing with this way up. Now, I don't think we have to really go through this anymore because what he does is he says, okay, let's build this. So here's our screen. And he says center it using those dotted blue lines so it says this way up. All right, so it's pretty much in the center. Then he says run it, and what you'll typically notice is it's not really in the center. All right, but you can go in there and you can tell it to auto-resolve stuff, and once you do that, it'll pretty much be in the center. That's all he has you do for that first program. I mean, we can do that, but to me that's sort of a waste of time to do that. But let's just take a look at what he did, because I want you to see I'm not making this up or anything, so he says, select the main storyboard, find a label, drag it into view, drop it so it's horizontally centered, and somewhere near the top. Select the text and make it this way up. All right, it says changing the text may shift its position, so drag it so it's horizontally centered again. All right, and again, I mean, I don't care. We can do it. It's not that it's it's a big thing one way or the other. So horizontally center it somewhere up near the top. Double click it this way up. All right, go back and make sure that it's still horizontally centered. Okay, there. Boom. All right. Again, we need to add auto layout constraints, he says. Okay, so control drag upward. You may or may not have noticed this, but when you control drag from almost any place, even if you do it accidentally, if you control drag from almost any direction in a control, up, down, left, right, and you let go, it's going to open up some kind of a dialog box. And sometimes that's the best way to learn, is to just jack around with this stuff. All right? So, I don't know what happened to my hard copies of this. It'd be much easier if I had them here, but I must have taken them upstairs. So he says, with that highlighted, control drag and let go. All right, and I think what we want is to hold down on shift and do top space to layout guide, and I think the other one is center horizontally. Whoops, I don't want center vertically. Sorry. Come on. And then just click off. Okay? And you'll see, as he mentions right there, that everything should turn blue, meaning, for lack of better words, it's pretty much hunky-dory. So I did the top space to top layout guide, all right, and the horizontal and container. It says, now press Control-R to run it, and it says when you bring it up, try shifting it around a few times. It says you'll see that pretty much it rotates so it looks at least fairly probably the way that you want it to look. So as always, we'll do a file save, run it. Yeah, if you do hear these tapes, if any of you do listen to them and you hear them at home, you'll know that I'm at my house typically because we've got a grandfather clock that chimes every 15 minutes. On one of them, my daughter comes down and goes, "Oh, are you taping?" And I said, "Yeah, a little louder, please." You know, and a couple times my dog goes nuts. So I used to do this. Before the semester started, I create close to 100 tapes, and I'd put them all out there on the system. Then I had a student complain because they said, you know, he's constantly opening up a soda or something to drink, and when he gets done, he goes, ah, and it drives me nuts. So I literally got called in and cussed out for that. And my boss said so. I said, you know, here's my response: screw him. I won't do them anymore. All right. And the same person who was complaining about it later came up to me and said, "How come you're not making as many tapes anymore?" And I just thought, oh my God, you know, it's. So there it is, and when I do my hardware rotate left, you see that it pretty much is centered. And I think at least that's the only thing he's trying to show you out of this first example. All right, but if you do go through everything that's in here, there will be at least one time if you go through all three of the apps that you're asked to build, in this chapter, there will be at least some time when you go and you'll have a lot of orange on your screen. All right, this is where we're going to start to get into it. So notice on the bottom here of page 142, let's configure our view controller to allow a different, smaller set of accepted orientations. All right, and that's what we're going to start getting into. The first thing to notice, just so you know when you look at this stuff, and you'll see this again, like I said, in a lot of books and a lot of articles and a lot of whatever. Have you ever noticed this when you bring up the simulator for the first time? What is the shape of the simulator? Anybody noticed? It's almost a perfect square. How many iPhones are there that are a perfect square? There's none that I know of. And although we talked about this in the last class, even an iPad isn't perfectly square. All right? That's why when you start getting into this stuff, the key to working with this, and we've looked at this, but not in any depth or breadth of coverage, if you look up on the screen here, is this thing down here that says WNEHNE. And this is what we're going to get to and talk about in just a little bit. All right, that stands for width any, height any. And basically, what that's considered to be is your base configuration, and you should always build first for your base configuration. But after you've got that, you can change what's in here, and you can start making changes in here, and those changes will only take effect to whatever you set this to. Does that make sense? All right, your base changes will remain the same. And that's what's new in iOS 8. Previously, you couldn't do that. So you look, if I take my mouse and I click in here, it brings this thing up. And this is designed to show me a lot of different possibilities. This little square right here. For instance, if I take my mouse, not my mouse, because I don't have one. If I take the touchpad and I go over to here, notice what it does. All right. Now it basically says, oh, you must be building for all compact width. Example, a 3.5 inch, 4.5 inch, or 4.7 inch foam. So you can change that stuff around in a lot of different ways. There's a table later on in this chapter that goes over the different things that you can set it to, and it explains the different categories and classifications. All right, I was confused after I read the table. So again, as always, I think sometimes the best way to do it is to just sit there and play with it. All right. So get an app that you build your base configuration and then make a copy of it if you have to, but then just start playing with it. All right. So notice what he says in here. It says in the Project Navigator, single-click viewcontroller.swift. Here we're going to implement a method defined in the UI view controller superclass that lets us specify which orientations we'll accept. The thing to realize when you look at this, okay? We didn't really talk much about this in the C class, but just so you hear this. In C, remember this? That's and that's or. Everybody remember that from the C class? We're in the C class? Well, if you just do one of these, that's a bitwise. All right, and that's the way it works really in most programming languages. If you use just a single ampersand, it's bitwise and. If you use a single, whatever that, I can't remember the name of it. No, it's not exploit, it's the separator, pipe sign, thank you. Then that pipe sign, a single pipe sign, that's bitwise or. The difference is when, you know that in most languages they do the short circuit evaluation. So if you're doing an OR and it finds the first one's true, it stops checking the second one, etc. With bitwise, you check every bit. You're always guaranteed that you're going to check everything. So what the author says is right here, he's using this uses a C mask to check. It says return whether or not you're using portrait or whether you're choosing landscape. All right, so it is one way of checking to see what the person is using. And you might say, well, yeah, but at the beginning you told us we could just check those. Yeah, you can just check that, then the only thing you have to worry about is portrait or landscape. But with a lot of applications, you want to give the user the opportunity to be in either mode. All right, so that's what he talks about here. Again, I don't want to read that to you, but he talks a little bit about what I just mentioned to you. All right. And here, as it says, these are the different masks that are provided for you. All right, and some of them even have combinations, as you can see. Not like it's, whoop, that was interesting. I don't know what that's doing. Oh, there you go. That was new. I was invited to join the wireless. When I first brought it up, it told me that there was a configuration problem, and so I stopped it. I came back up again. See this paragraph that's right here? It's in the middle of page 144. Does this make sense to people? Just take a quick read on that if you would. So as they mentioned, device orientation is how you're holding it, and the interface is how you react to the way the device rotation is set. All right? But they're not exactly the same thing, and sometimes people use them interchangeably when they're not really the same thing. All right, so I'm going to run through this one with you. Like I said, there wasn't a lot to that previous one, but we're going to take a look at this, and what they ask you to build in this example right here is this app. And I think we may or may not have even looked at it earlier. I don't remember. But the idea is with this one, there we go. What you want to have happen in this is they ask you to put these in. So put a button here, copy it over there, copy it over there, and copy it over there. by now, hopefully everybody's comfortable with the fact that if I go and set up this button right here, and I configure the wazoo out of it, and I do that control where I drag down to make a copy, all that stuff copies. That's not typically what you're going to want. So the reason I'm telling you that is if you're building your interface and you're going to be copying a lot of controls all over the place on your screen, what you really should be doing is copying the controls and then going back in and setting up all of your constraints. You shouldn't set up the constraints first, okay? And it really wouldn't matter which one you use here, but what he wants is he wants that UL to be flush against the corner here, that UR flush against that corner, that LR flush against that corner, and that LL. So it's upper left, upper right, lower left, and lower right. That make sense? All right. In fact, if you want to see it, because I've even got it built already, so might make it a little bit easier than to spend all the time rebuilding it. I think this one is layout. All right, and don't worry about the other stuff that's in here. This is just stuff that they have you do later on in the project. All right, but the idea is if you follow their steps in here, if you take a look, when you first run this, if there are no constraints on it whatsoever, all right, and you run it, you're going to see the button that says UL, and it'll be somewhere pretty close to where you want it to be. If you're lucky, you might see the corner of the one that says UR, and you probably see little to nothing of the other two. All right? Because what they're trying to do is set the stuff relative to what you currently see on the screen, not relative to the way it really looks or acts or whatever in the, quote, real world. And that's what I believe, at least, the author tries to get across to you. So what he has you do is follow a bunch of steps and do the configuration. I'm going to show you the after product when we get done, if it comes up. But ideally, at least, okay, so there's the one button, there's the other one, and here's, well, I guess you can't see them, but if I dragged up a little, you'd see the other two that are down here, all right? And again, is this that big a thing? The answer is no, not at all. But what the author is showing you here is everything is going to be lined up perfectly after putting in all the constraints, all right? I always, you know, one of the reasons I take some time at home and do these step by step is, first of all, if I make a mistake, you don't know because I'll just stop the tape and redo it again. All right. But the other thing is, and that actually doesn't happen that often. A lot of times I'll make a mistake and if it's not that bad, I'll just keep it in there. But then we spend a lot of time watching me build a simple interface, and to me that's kind of a waste of time. Maybe you agree with that, maybe you don't agree with that. I don't know. But notice if I come in here and do a hardware, rotate left, all right, how stuff keeps and is where it's supposed to be. All right, so the idea is that button's here, that button's here, that one's here, and that one's there. All that makes sense? All right, and we're going to go through the steps that he does in order to do this. So you say, well, what about the rest of it? Well, first he has you put a button here right in the middle of these two when you get done. And then when you run it, it doesn't look real bad when you run it in portrait. But when you put it in landscape, this overwrites this. Because again, there were no constraints put in there. All right? So he has you put in the constraints, and after you do it, it looks pretty much like this. Then he says, well, then go create a new button here called write and do the same thing. But when you're constraining this, typically what you want to do is you want to, you know, we saw that little thing up here, this little thing that has the, everybody know what I'm talking about, your pin menu? All right, so typically when you're pinning something to the left, you'll want to use that one, and that one, but you don't want to touch that one. And if you're doing something to the right, you'll want to do that one, and that one, and you won't want to touch that one. All right? Now, do you always want to pin something to the top or to the bottom? The thing to realize, this is getting pinned to the top. This is getting pinned to the bottom. That makes sense? This is getting pinned to its nearest neighbor. That's not getting pinned to the top or to the bottom. All right? And the author goes, I think, to great lengths to explain that to you throughout the book. Okay. Then what he does after you build this, the other thing I didn't mention is, he says, well, what if you wanted these buttons to basically stretch just about the whole way across here? And that's why he has you do that. He has you make them and make them real big and turn a set of color on them. And when you do that, when I set these two up, when there were no constraints whatsoever, none. What ends up happening is this one's about the height that it is, and this one is about that big, when there are no constraints on them whatsoever. But once you set them both up with constraints, that's the size. And as you saw, it looks like that whether you are landscape or whether you're portrait. Come on, set yourself. Well, I'm sure having enough rotation problems today. All right, so let's run through the steps that he has in order for you to do this. Again, he says build it, don't put anything on there whatsoever, no constraints, and then run it. Holy moly, no. And this is what happens. Whoops. So in portrait mode, you see the one you put in first, and you don't see the rest of them. They're there, you just don't see them. Because again, it's been configured for that square that you saw in there as opposed to the actual device that it's going to be running on. Then when you look at the other one, you see the UL button and just the edge of the UR button. All right, because again, as of right now, there are no constraints that have been put on this whatsoever. So the author says, so far not so good. So what happened? And that's what he's saying. Again, it says what we really want is to have each label sticking tightly to its nearest corner. So in order to do that, all right, it says Interface Builder is smart enough to examine this and figure out what you want. So the cheesy, cheapest way to do this, if that's all you're going to have on your interface, is to highlight all 4 buttons, choose Editor from the menu, resolve layout issues, add missing constraints. All right? And you can do that always. You can do that at any time. Okay? Sometimes when you do that, you're going to have both update frames and add missing constraints. You'll have one, the other, or both. And when I have both, I've tried doing it both ways. I tried to update, then add the constraints, but it makes more sense to me to add the constraints first and then update. That to me made the most sense, so I did it that way. All right? So it says knowing this works is one thing, but to use constraints like this most effectively, it's better to have you have some kind of an idea, again, somehow how to look under the hood, so to speak. So the author says, go back to this button right here, and notice this. This is not a minor thing; it's a major thing. That when you've got the lines like this and they're solid blue, that says you've got constraints, and those constraints are unambiguous. When you've got the dashed blue line here, that says that you're moving something into place. So they mean 2 different things. It's not like it's a big thing, but it's important that you understand the difference. All right, not only visually, but actually what they mean. So as mentioned, each of the solid blue lines represents a constraint. And if I go back and I look at my code here, you'll notice down here, all I did was click buttons. But there were a lot of constraints that were put in there for me. Now, 2 things about these constraints. If I knew for sure I didn't want that one, just that one, let's just say I know for sure I don't want that one, okay? Then the easiest thing to do is literally to take your mouse, put it on there, and hit your delete key, okay? Be real leery, because when you go in and you do the update frames, you can do update constraints, okay? But there's also one in there that says clear constraints. If you've got your view controller highlighted and you click clear constraints, now there are no constraints. So if you just spent a lot of time, and I don't think the Command Z works to set them back again. I could be wrong on that, but I don't think it does. All right. So it's always a good idea to sit there and save before you do something. It's like the days, at least, and I hope Jim's telling them that stuff now in the 147 class, that before you do an insert, an update, or a delete, that you do a select first to find out if indeed what you're about to change is what you wanted to change, type of an idea. Same kind of thing here. All right. The other thing too is, if I want to look at an individual constraint, if you take a look up on the screen here, if I click on that constraint, the information that is shown as soon as I do that in my inspector up here. All right. So I can go in there and I can change things in there also. Again, the author does a pretty good job, I think, in this chapter of explaining this stuff, but I'm trying to hit some of the highlights with you. All right. Again, it says the constraints that Xcode creates depends on exactly where you place the label, so yours may not look like the same numbers, etc., as what are in the book. All right. But this is what he talks about in here when you look at what's in here, because it's kind of scary. All right. So what the author is saying, and this is the mistake that I was making earlier in the semester, if you remember, a couple times at least, I went into the pin menu when we got, I think it was a pin, we got this stuff, and I was changing these numbers. All right. If you're going to change those, you should change them early and once and not again. All right. So if I had, for instance, if I come through here, I can change the height, and I can change the width, and the X and the Y coordinate. First of all, does everybody know what those mean? All right. X, Y, right? Okay. And height, width. But if I've got a constraint like this, it's showing you basically, it's trying to show you the constraints, but you can highlight any constraint that's in there. You can highlight any one of them. So you can click on it, you can choose edit, and you can manually make changes too. Why that's important, just so you know, is when you start to do that, you're going to see over here in the area that's in your inspector, is there's going to be a button that's called install. And what happens is if you click that button, so if we go down to that WNEHNE and we reset this for something else, then we come in and we start monkeying with this stuff, and we click the button that says install, that uninstalls those changes for that view. That's what the key to doing this is. And if I confused you, we'll walk through it a little bit more later. But again, I'd strongly advise you to take a look at that adaptive layout tutorial that are in the set of notes that I gave you today, even if you don't take the time. And I was just thinking about it. I've got the code too. I just have to put it out there, and I don't think I put it out on the folder. But I'll try to remember to do that during the break. All right. Okay, as it says, in this case, two of the constraints deal with the label's position relative to its superview. One thing to realize, every single thing that you have on your screen is considered a view. You know that if you go into the document outline, you've got a big view, but every control you put into that view is known as a subview of that view. And the reason I say that is you can, with most controls, you can take and put a control on your view, and quite often you can take another control and put it inside of that first control. All right? So what you've got then is a subview with a subview inside of it. And that's totally legit to do that. Not only that, you literally can have multiple views inside of the same main view. That's also totally legit to do. All right. All right, this is where, here, we're going to go for about 5 more minutes and we'll take a break. But the author says, grab another label and drag it over into the layout area. This time, pretty much center it, so put it right there. All right, and then he says, after you've done that, run it. And again, as mentioned, notice where it goes. That says left. That should be right here. Because again, it has no constraints that you've added to it. And that's what he keeps talking about in here. All right. It says, after placing the label to the left, give it a name like left. rotate into landscape, and you'll see that the left label maintains its distance from the top, placing it a long way below the center. Oops. All right. He says what we need is a new kind of constraint. Part of the problem with this is there's so many darn places where you can change things, update things, etc., and some of them mean the same thing, whether you do them up from a menu or whether you do it from an option down below. Some of them don't. That's why I said this is a big learning process. And anybody who says they're an expert on it has been doing it full time and nothing else for a while, because it's fairly new. All right. So it says what we really need is a new constraint to make all this work. Go back into Xcode, select the left label in your storyboard, adding the constraint to force it to stay vertically centered. Editor, align, vertical center in container. That should be the same one as if you click the align button on the bottom, because if you click that align button, there's a thing that says vertical center in container. That's the same option. So you can do it either from the align button that's in the bottom right-hand corner, or you can do it from the menu. Either one of those should work. And it's not that one's preferable, it's which one are you more comfortable with. All right? You can change off, it really and truly doesn't matter. All right. Then the author says, but after you do that, you might find that it's going to need a horizontal constraint. So as it says, you can add this. It says you can add this by making sure the label is selected and then choosing Editor, Resolve, Auto Layout Issues. You've seen that before. We've talked about this. All right. All right. Then they say do the same thing on the right. And when you get done, lo and behold, if everything worked correctly, it should now look like this. Okay? Ideally, that's what you're going to have. So the author says that's fine and dandy, but we can do far more with just a few more clicks. There's just in this section, there's like 2 more pages. I know exactly where I am. So with his full width labels, the author says what we want is this. And if you remember, when I just showed you mine, that's pretty much the way mine looked. Again, mine's not perfect, but it's pretty much the way it looks. All right. So ideally, again, what we had was we had the UL button there, the UR button there, LL, LR, and these two centered in the middle. But what he says is, what if you wanted to take these and stretch each one of them so that whether you were in portrait or landscape mode, they would literally stretch to the whole thing. Okay. And I want to mention this because I'll forget otherwise. Everybody notice little gap there, little gap there. Don't worry about the one in the middle. But you notice these gaps? What you may or may not have noticed is when you bring up a lot of these menus, and when you hit like the align and the stuff on the bottom, there'll be a checkbox there that says constrain margins. If that checkbox is checked, you get this. If the checkbox is unchecked, it goes all the way to the end. So literally, do you want it to hold true with the margins as they were set when you first set this thing up, or don't you? All right, so that's what they're talking about in there. So as mentioned, the hardest part of doing this is being able to visually verify what you want. All right. So the author says here, if you do go through and you run through it, what you'll find is it may or may not look exactly the way that you want it to look. So notice what he says. We need to add a constraint to make these labels fill the entire width of the view. So select them both and choose Editor, Pin, Horizontal, Spacing. All right. Again, you can also choose the align button, and there's a horizontal spacing in there. But this one, I think this is the one you have to use, pin horizontal spacing. There's also one that he'll talk about in just a minute, equal height and equal width. And with equal height and equal width, they're important for 2 reasons. First of all, they make them the same height. But they guarantee that they stay the same height regardless of the orientation. All right? So again, that's ideally what we get when we get done. Says that's pretty close, but notice when you first do this, that's taking up almost all the room and that's taking up very little. And then you go and do what I just mentioned, and that is you highlight both of them, you do an editor pin widths equally. Okay? And you can do that, you can hold down on the shift key and you can highlight as many controls as you want. If you want to make sure you've got uniformity in your UI, that you could set the widths and the height of everything if that's what you wanted to do. For instance, when you're working on the calculator, if you wanted to make sure each button was the same height and the same width, you could essentially highlight every button that was in there and choose that, and choose the editor pin widths equally and editor pin, I think there's a heights equally too. All right. The author says when you do that, you'll notice the constraints will be orange, meaning that there's still some things it doesn't understand. So you again go in and do an editor resolve auto layout issues, update frames, and ideally when you get done, now that's what it looks like. All right, perfect place. This is right where I wanted to be. So we're on page 153. Let's take a break. All right, and it looks like it's 4, so let's come back at 4:15. All right, and we'll pick it up from there.